everyone, and welcome to Women's Health Tech Wednesdays. I am your host, Nina Joshi, and today we will be bringing on a very special guest, Dr. Carolyn Kay, who works at Roche. As you may have noticed, this is a little bit of a different format for today's episode because Carolyn has so graciously offered to host a 15-minute virtual networking and meet and greet session after our discussion. So for this episode today, please feel free to keep your videos off and your mics muted. And if you have any questions, pop them in the chat, and then you will be able to turn your videos back on when we get to the meet and greet portion of today's episode. So with that, would like to formally bring on our guest, Carolyn. Hi, Carolyn. Thanks so much for joining today. Oh, it looks like you're on mute.
Aha, okay, finally able to unmute. Well, thanks so much for having me, Nina and the HITLAB team. I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, we are so excited to have you for our conversation today. And I think to start things off, would love if you could just share with us a little bit, of course, this is Women's Health Tech Wednesday, so we have to ask, what does women's health tech mean to you?
I think for me, it's the intersection and ecosystem of health, technology, science in addressing some of the needs in women's health, and also leveraging, the lived experiences of women. And I do want to asterisk that and say that, is expanded out to, folks who are trans and gender nonconforming who are also affected by these issues.
Absolutely. Great definition. And with that, would love, you have such an illustrious career. Would love if you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, and how you kind of became the senior manager and really working on cervical cancer at Roche.
Yeah, so I think, well, first of all, I'm a New York born and bred girl, city girl. And at heart, I'm a teacher. So that's really how I first got my, feet wet. Was teaching and really sharing health information with people, because I really feel that in order to make the best decisions about your health, you need to have a baseline level of understanding of the facts. And so that's what it really drives me, and that's what drove me to become an OBGYN, because there's lots of opportunities to learn and share information with people so that they can make the most informed decisions about their health and live their best life. So that's kind of how this all started. And as I became an OBGYN, I really loved, talking with people, helping people make good decisions about their health, but also was a little bit frustrated by some of the things that we just didn't have the technology to address. And so was looking more for, a way to address those and to be a part of bringing solutions to people.
Wow, that's amazing. And I love that this kind of all started for you just through your love of teaching. I think that's incredible.
Yeah, I think I love teaching people most of all, because people share with me some of the, misconceptions or things that they heard. And there's some really wild things out there. I'm sure you can think of some. But I learn all the time just by talking to folks about what are some of the hangups, what are some of the things that are floating around out there, and then, being able to empower people to make good decisions for themselves.
That's incredible. And I would definitely love, maybe later in the conversation, if you can maybe even debunk some misconceptions for us so that we can also revel in your wealth of knowledge as well. Because I think kind of being that voice of truth, especially now where there is a lot of noise on the internet, I think is really important.
Absolutely.
So I know that you, are an OBGYN, but also working in pharmaceuticals. What was the catalyst? What urged you to work and kind of pivot to the pharmaceutical industry after attaining your MD?
Yeah, so Roche is a really, really large company, most well known for their pharmaceuticals, and I'm in the diagnostics portion of the business. So this is like all the testing that goes on, everything that's been happening with COVID. Roche has been involved with pretty much any test that you can think of. Roche has some kind of footing in there. And specifically, I work in their cervical cancer screening part, and this involves, screening like HPV testing, you may have heard, and I can certainly elaborate more on that. And then other tests that help clinicians and the people who are reviewing some of these results make the best decisions to help people, to inform people.
Wow, that's amazing. And I know also kind of just from when we've been talking about this non-traditional medical path that you've kind of taken, would love if you could elaborate a little bit more on that too.
Oh, non-traditional. Yes, absolutely. I'm not traditional. I didn't do the traditional thing that I was supposed to do. Um, when I was an undergrad, I felt a lot of pressure to go this pre-med route, and I think I sort of rebelled against it. And that was really tough for me, being in a, Korean household, and my parents had very specific expectations. They were immigrants themselves, and so they worked really hard to help me along. And I felt like I sort of had to pay them back, or I was obligated to them in some way. So I really struggled with that early on. But once I was able to realize, like, no, I have to do what's true to myself and what I believe is right. I started to look into other avenues, particularly in teaching. But even as I was teaching, I just realized, like, I love talking about health, and I just love empowering people to have knowledge about their health. And so I did ultimately end up in medicine, tried to rebel against my parents and ended up, fulfilling that part. But I still do very much do this because out of a joy and a love for sharing this information with people. So that's one thing. And then I went into medical school residency, and I followed the traditional path. And by all means, I thought that I would be, your traditional doctor practicing in a hospital or a clinic setting and delivering babies, doing surgeries. And I did do that for a while. And I think that's still so incredible. And shout out to, my colleagues in OBGYN who are still doing all those good, wonderful things. It's made even harder now in the US. Just politically, we're in a really difficult time right now. So shout out to all the OBGYNs who are continuing to do this hard work. But, I think I realized also that it wasn't quite the right fit. And that was okay. That was okay to not be in the right place, and realizing that actually was a real struggle. So once I realized, it's okay that I don't fit in here, there are other things out there for me, I started to look around and look at tech. And this opportunity at Roche was the perfect fit, because I do a lot of education, a lot of teaching. I incorporate technology. I still affect patient care, even though I don't take care of patients directly. And by the way, I forgot to mention, this is not constitute medical advice. This is purely for, informational, educational purposes. So it doesn't substitute talking to your doctor. But yeah, I mean, I do get to affect patient care on a much, higher level. And it's just been a great, great ride.
That is honestly very, very inspiring. I think, just hearing your story from undergrad, as well as the, your learnings just during your residency program, I think just has that underlying theme of just, staying true to yourself and not, relying on other people's expectations about what you want to do with your life. So I think that is very, very inspiring for any career. I really thank you for sharing that with us.
Happy to. It was definitely a struggle. And there were definitely dark days, because I was like, why can't I fit in? Why can't I just be like everybody else? And then I think eventually coming to that realization, like, you know what? It's okay. It's okay. And I can still bring value in other ways. And I think that's one thing I hope that this audience takes away from today, is that it's okay to not, be like everybody else, because you bring value in other ways.
100%. And I think what's so exciting about this time is that there are so many new types of jobs, new types of career paths and positions that are just constantly evolving with tech. So there's always, I think it's just so incredible to see that there's this amazing, combination of tech and science and art and so many other things coming together. So I think that it's a really amazing time to be in healthcare right now.
Yeah, it's an amazing time to be a doctor, even, Nina. I think that you bring up a great point, is that, I still consider myself a doctor, right? My degree has not gone away. I earned that degree, but it just looks different now. Doesn't look like the way that I originally thought and what most people think of when they think of doctor. And I can tell you that I have some amazing colleagues who are doctors, and they're doing incredible things that don't look like, the traditional doctor in an office. Like, they're helping people with design of, operating rooms, or like addressing patient care and quality. So it can look very different to be a doctor today. And actually, I applaud that, and I'm happy about that.
That's what makes it more fun, makes it more interesting.
Absolutely.
Amazing. And so I know a lot of the work that you do, I mean, just within your practice as an OBGYN, but also specifically with Roche, has to do with cervical cancer, cervical cancer screening and care. Would love if you could talk a little bit more about, what it means to have cervical cancer care in the States at this point. I think you would have a really interesting perspective on that.
Yeah, I would say in comparison to just other countries around the world, I think the US is doing a fairly decent job. That's not to say that there are flaws and there are big, areas for improvement. But when we look at just even the rates of screening, it varies state by state, but we're somewhere in the ballpark of 70 to 80% of people who have been screened in the last few years. So that's actually pretty good. But we can always do better, right? And that's not to say we can't do better. And actually, when you look at the way that screening has been conducted in the US and the rates of cervical cancer, we've actually come down significantly since we've implemented screening in general health exams. So you might think of, when you go to the doctor, you get like a pap smear usually, or some kind of cervical screening test, right, as part of your wellness care. So now that we've implemented that, we've driven down rates of cervical cancer, but in the last few years, those levels have plateaued. So we're not going down even more, we're kind of staying level. And so there's a lot we can do to address that. There's many reasons why that might be the case. And that's kind of where I'm focused on in the US and abroad.
Absolutely. For you, and well, so many questions. I think would love to learn about some of the work that you're doing when it comes to cervical cancer screening at Roche specifically. What types of innovative solutions are you kind of looking at driving, when it comes to bringing down that prevalence rate?
Yeah, so Roche is doing really incredible things in this space. In particular, where we're looking at whole solutions. So not just like a one test here and a one test there. We really want to tackle this problem in its entirety, right? We recognize that it's not going to take one thing to fix this problem of cervical cancer around the world. It's many things, many people coming together to unite around this cause. And so we want to provide solutions from start to finish with respect to cervical cancer screening. And yes, some of that does involve testing. So one of the main things that we're looking at, or we have in our toolbox, is HPV screening. And that's a big deal because we now know that 99% of cervical cancers are associated with a virus called human papillomavirus, or HPV. So this is really great because now we can test for HPV, the cause, before you even get to any serious disease or illness. Right now, with the flaw with the PAP is that this is a great technology. We've had it since like the 1920s, 1940s, where you look at cells under a microscope. And that's great. That's done a really good job. But there's issues with that, right? You have to go to the doctor and have an exam, which for some people that's a challenge. Even the cells that are seen under a microscope, it can be interpreted differently, and different technologists can see things differently. Sometimes there's some variability in how it's read. So there's a lot of things that can be improved upon. It's done a great job. And now that we have new technologies and we understand how cervical cancer develops, we can zero in before we even get to cell changes in the cells or in the cervix.
That's incredible. And so just let me know, correct me if I'm wrong, but so a pap smear is used to just detect changes in cell, whereas HPV can essentially pinpoint kind of the cause of those changes, which is
right. Yeah. So that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. So yeah, I mean, HPV is really common. If you're sexually active, chances are you've been exposed to it or you have it. And something like 80% of the human population has had it or it's been exposed to it. So it's super, super common. But what's interesting is that it doesn't actually cause problems for most people. Our immune system is able to keep it under control, eliminate it, or get it under check, and it's not a big problem. But for some people, if it remains and our immune system is not able to keep it under control, it starts to cause these changes in the cell that can lead to precancer and cancer. And so that's what the pap smear does, is it looks at those cells to make sure that there haven't been any changes.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for
Yeah,
clarifying
thanks.
that. And so, I mean, and I would love to learn a little bit more. I know you were kind of talking about how, there's been this plateau that you've been seeing when it comes to the prevalence. And I would imagine, when, COVID first started and those routine PAP appointments weren't as accessible, that may be the case. But I think, after when we're, a few years into the pandemic and things are starting to have this new normal within the clinical setting, what are some of the barriers that you've been seeing when it comes to just having those types of routine screenings?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's so apropos, especially with all the things that we've been dealing with COVID. I mean, many of the problems that existed pre-COVID are still there, right? So, people having trouble with access to care in the first place, whether that's they can't take time off of work to make it to the doctor's office, or they don't have a way of getting to the office. Maybe they have childcare needs and they're not addressed at their clinic. There's no one there to watch their kids. For some people, it could be, a history where they've had a traumatic experience or maybe a bad experience, and they are very reluctant to go to a healthcare facility and seek care. Or maybe it's just even, maybe it's none of those. Maybe it's just don't want to get a very private exam.
Right.
So there are many things that have existed pre-COVID. I think it's just been exacerbated even more so with COVID. And people, not wanting to go into an office where there might be other people who are sick. The one thing, I'm glad you brought this up, because the one thing that we are looking at now, and I think COVID has really laid bare, is testing at home or testing yourself without having to go all the way, trekking all the way to a doctor's office or special place to get testing done. So Roche actually has added an indication where people can test themselves under the supervision of a healthcare worker. But this is only outside the US. And we're always looking to increase access and increase our reach. So hopefully we'll see that also come to the US, but right now just outside the US. But that's a big step, especially because cervical cancer is a disease of disparities. It's largely in low and middle income countries where people are having trouble with access to care. And so this is a huge step in meeting people where they are. And I think that's so important as a biotech technology company, is to understand where people are at and then meeting them there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's so incredible that, that work is kind of already starting to be done with Roche, really testing different ways to, exactly to your point, how do we meet people where they're at and make it as kind of easy as possible? How do we just minimize the burden, the barrier, so that everyone can get the access and kind of stay on top of it when it comes to cervical cancer screenings? That is incredible. That's very cool.
I'm super excited, and I think we need to do more of that. So we're going to continue powering on.
That's amazing. I'm so curious. Have you noticed any type of education or information barrier when it comes to the need for Pap smears? I'm only asking because I think when you're at your primary care doctor, they're kind of talking about, okay, you may need to start doing Pap smears. It's kind of seen as just, something you need to do. But I'm curious to see if it's kind of been minimized, or if there's any other information barriers that you've seen when it comes to the need or the sense of urgency when it comes to these types of screenings.
Nina, I think you touched on something so accurate, and it's definitely something I've been guilty of as a physician. We only have so much time in that annual visit to address with patients that, some of these things sort of kind of become routine and they fall to the wayside, and we don't really address that. And, I've definitely been guilty of being like, oh yeah, cervical cancer, PAPs, we got that under control. We got that, right? Like, we know what we can do. We have a PAP and we can address that. But I didn't realize, now that I've come into this line of work, that, there's a lot of stigma, first of all, with HPV. Oftentimes it's categorized as a sexually transmitted infection, but I really don't see it that way. I mean, it is transmitted through close contact and skin to skin contact, and often those are in sexual contexts. But I want to remove that stigma away from that, because it is just so common. It's so common. If you're human, you have sex, you've probably had it. And it's not, generally, again, it's not a big deal, because our immune system is able to get rid of it. But we do need to be vigilant and watch that. But first, addressing the stigma, that's number one. Another challenge is just knowing about human papillomavirus itself. Many people don't know that, what it is, or understand its connection to cervical cancer. And even now, as we have, a lot of people are familiar with the PAP, but they're not as familiar with some of the newer generation testing that's coming down the pike, which is in HPV testing. And it's actually not that new. It's been around for a while. It is included in guidelines. It can be offered, but right now, in many countries, the US included, our infrastructure is not, it's set up in a way that it's readily available. So you may want to ask your doctor about that. And you might find that your doctor may not be in a position to offer that because their hospital may not, or lab is not set up yet for that. But I'm hoping that over the next few years, we'll be seeing more of that happen, that transition happen. So those are probably those two: stigma and just education about what HPV is, how that's involved with cervical cancer.
That is incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. I wholeheartedly agree about the stigma component. And I think, that may also be why patients may be afraid to even bring it up with their providers as well. So I think, finding ways to really remove it and have an open and honest discussion that is free of any type of bias or judgment, I think is really important. So I love that you also brought that up.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have asked, in my experience when I was in practice, they were like, where did I get it from? And it's really challenging to figure out where someone has gotten it because it's so prevalent throughout the population. And I want to give credit to, I don't know who it came from. I want to say this is from Ina Park, who's a physician at UCSF. I think it came from her, but this kind of like glitter, when you're playing around with glitter, it just gets everywhere. And this is very similar with HPV, is that, it's everywhere and it can be transmitted just not without that much difficulty. So again, really wanting to address that stigma and saying, like, it's very common. There's often not a way to detect where it came from, who gave it to you. It's a lot of people have it.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think just having those types of conversations is a really important place to start. So thank you so much for just kind of shedding light on that. And I think on that note too, just given your experience and, within the work that you're doing now with Roche, but also just, just from your practice days, would love if you could share, what are some lessons learned or advice for those, women, others, just when it comes to managing their health. Would love if you could share a little bit more about just some of the things that you've learned in your practice.
Oh yeah. I mean, be your best advocate. I think that could be really hard for just culturally and socially for a lot of women. I remember when I went to my first gynecology visit, I was like 16 and I was having really bad cramps. And my gynecologist shamed me because I didn't know like where my uterus was like anteverted, like was it forward facing or kind of was it tilted backwards? I had no idea. I was 16 and I got shamed for that. So I just kind of did whatever she said, but looking back, I wish that I had been a better advocate for myself and said like, hey, I don't know what that is. Can you explain that to me? And I think I probably just was like, okay, and kind of slunk away. But yeah, you be your best advocate. And if you feel like you're not in a good position to be so, or you don't feel strong enough, bring someone who will make you feel like you will, or who will help you be your best advocate, or who will be in place for you. So yeah, I just want to recognize, I think women in general just are socially conditioned to not ask questions, or we don't want to, rock the boat or seen as challenging. But in healthcare, it's your life, it's your health on the line. And it's so important that, be your best advocate.
That's amazing. I want to like write that down and like post it somewhere. Everything you just said.
I need this for myself too. I'm a physician and I struggle with this all the time when I go to my own doctor. So I think we can all have like a cheerleader on our shoulder that sits there when we go to the doctor and says like, ask about this and it's okay. Like tell them this.
I love that. So for anyone that has any type of doctor's visit soon, just think of Carolyn on your shoulder, reminding you to advocate for yourself. I think
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Love that. And I know we are about 2 minutes out, and I'm sure there's a lot of other folks that have more direct questions for you during the meet and greet portion. But I think just to cap things off, would love if you could share, you've given us so much amazing words of wisdom just through the work that you're doing and your practice. But as, someone just when it comes to all the time that you've spent building a career, would love if you could share, what piece of advice do you have for your younger self, or for maybe those that are now just starting to kind of enter their professional lives or their careers?
I think I would say don't be so hard on yourself if
Mm,
things don't look the way that you had hoped for. I think when I think about my 16-year-old self in New York, I was thinking like, oh, I'm going to be a high-powered, I don't know, in a fancy building, and
love
I'll
it.
always be wearing like fancy clothes and a suitcase, a briefcase. And my life does not look like that today. But I'm happy and I'm glad it didn't turn out the way that I had hoped. There's definitely twists and turns and setbacks, but it's okay. And my life doesn't look like my friends or some of my other colleagues. And I think there was a lot of agita about that, but
Right.
it's okay because in my own way, I found my niche, and there is a niche for all of you in your own lives, in your own communities. So it's okay if, you don't, your life doesn't look exactly like someone else's or the way that you had hoped, because sometimes the truth and the real life version of it can be even better than you had dreamed.
That is incredible. Carolyn, physician, life coach, technologist, all of the things.
I think a few things got picked up in there that I'm not, but thank you, Nina.
Thank you so much for just, really just opening up the conversation and just sharing, your knowledge and your experience. And I think, I have learned a ton. And for those that are interested in having maybe some more FaceTime and asking Carolyn specific questions, please stay on because we will now transition to the meet and greet portion of our discussion. But before we kind of launch into that, just have a couple of quick announcements. We have our next episode next Wednesday with one of our innovation fellows at HITLAB, so please be sure to check that out. We also have our digital health symposium on August 25th. All of the registration information is in the chat. We also have a HITLAB podcast that we're launching, which we're really excited about. We're launching it today. So if you're interested, use the website below hitlab.org/podcast to get that downloaded. And wanted to give a huge shout out to our guest, Carolyn. And so for everyone now, feel free to turn on your video so we can kind of get that started. And looking forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks, everyone. And for those that are interested in the meet and greet, please stay on the line. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.